Does wearing vintage clothing make you racist? There is a reason, after all, why the hashtag vintage style, not vintage values exists. Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Katie. I am a graduate student at Parsons School of Design in the master's program called Fashion Studies, and I study the sociocultural phenomenon that is fashion. So, being a graduate student, I have been working on this long-ass essay for one of my classes called Fashion Studies Key Concepts, where we go over the different theoretical frameworks that we use to study fashion. I decided to research fashion as subculture, and I've been looking at how and why people wear vintage clothing, but not just how and why they wear it, but what happens when they post it on social media. And I have been looking at tons and tons of photos of people dressed up in a variety of different vintage styles from the 1920s to the 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., etc. And the question that keeps coming up over and over in my head is, does wearing vintage fashion make you racist? So let's dig into it. First of all, let's take a little detour away from the giant elephant in the room and just take a step back and look about what we know about fashion. That is, after all, the point of going to a graduate school program about fashion. To put it very basically, at the very basic essence, clothing serves the utilitarian purpose of covering our bodies. We've evolved from mammals who had hair all over their bodies to mammals who no longer have hair all over our bodies, and so to protect ourselves from exposure, whether that be the heat, the sand, the sun, or the cold, the ice, and the snow, we made stuff to cover our bodies. If you fast forward a few 100,000 years of human creativity, innovation, and expression, we now have what we call fashion. I feel like I should also talk about the way that we define fashion as being Eurocentric, but that's a topic for another video. So, being very visual creatures as humans, we use fashion to communicate something about ourselves and who we are to the rest of the world. Fashion has this incredible ability to communicate a variety of meanings, from our group identity like band t-shirts to socioeconomic status like luxury goods, to creating gender through our clothing, and illustrating our nationality, so on and so forth. But most importantly for the sake of this video is that it can communicate our values. For example, wearing a quote-unquote modest outfit with a cross on a necklace as your choice in jewelry might tell others without explicitly stating that you believe in certain religious beliefs and practices such as Christianity or Catholicism and modesty. Alternatively, putting on ripped black skinny jeans and an MCR t-shirt might tell people that you value the emo mindset and love listening to skinny white boys whine about their lives. And these identifying objects, images, and symbols is what we call a signal in fashion and anthropology. And if we want to think about this through the scholars, if we look at Dick Hebdige and his chapter on style as intentional communication, the literature argues that what we wear sends messages to others about what we think, what we believe in, what we think about ourselves, how we relate ourselves to the world, what we want the rest of the world to think about us, whether we're with or against the grain of mainstream culture. And the desire to communicate this information, while I think it's inherent in all humans, can motivate and influence our fashion decisions when we go shopping for new clothes and when we get dressed in the morning. So with this premise in mind that fashion and the clothes that we wear can communicate something to other people, the question is then, what does wearing vintage clothing communicate? What does it signify? What are the motivations behind wearing it? What might influence someone to wear vintage fashion? And how might wearing vintage fashion make you racist? Before we get too much further into it, I need to make a disclaimer that what I am saying is going to mostly be based off of my own personal opinions and observations and is loosely based on the research that I did for this essay. However, if you want the actual research, you're going to have to wait for that essay to be published as an article, which I would not hold your breath on since I am simply a first semester graduate student. But what I'm saying is that while this is based on my research, I'm not practicing any peer-reviewed methods here, but I'm going to do the best to cite all of my sources, and I will link everything that I cite in the description below so that you can go forth and do more research on your own terms as you see fit. So, let's finally get into the dirty details. So the way I see it and what I've gotten from my research and from being a part of the online vintage community myself, there's a couple of different motivations and influences that might make someone wear vintage clothing. And I don't think that all of them necessarily start with the desire to want to communicate yourself in a particular way. Some might get into wearing true vintage, meaning items that were actually made in the time period that they look like they're from for ethical, environmental, and sustainability purposes as a way of pushing against fast fashion and capitalism in fashion. But others might get into it simply for the aesthetic and that they like the way it looks, and I think that this is where the confusion about why someone might wear vintage fashion can come from. The thing is, according to another scholar named Heike Jens, fashion can also carry with it a very strong capacity for memory and the ability to invoke nostalgia. This is how something called decadism happens, which is a term coined by another scholar named Christopher Brewer. And decadism is essentially when we ascribe a very narrow fashion trend to represent an entire decade or time period of fashion, when in reality, fashion trends, both mainstream and subcultural fashion trends, tend to be a lot more fluid than what you might think of when someone says 1970s fashion or 1830s fashion. Some scholars argue that this is detrimental to fashion studies and fashion history on the academic side of things, but the fact of the matter is, nevertheless, people tend to view fashion history in this way. But that association of particular fashion trends to specific decades also allows us to associate what was happening in those decades to that fashion. Things like historical events and cultural movement and music from that decade. And in the case of this video, a certain set of personal and political beliefs and ideals that then come to be represented in the fashion. So when we see a 1950s illustration of a perfect looking, white, heterosexual, nuclear family unit, we in the 21st century know that that image does not exist in a vacuum. It is steeped in the historical and social context of the 1950s. Think Jim Crow era policies where racial segregation was formally codified into law. So when we see a 21st century person wearing clothing and an outfit that looks like it could have walked straight out of that 1950s illustration, the structured bodice, the nipped-in waist, and the very full skirt, our brains might make that association to that specific historical, social, cultural, political context that surrounds that specific fashion trend. But just because we associate these historical fashion trends with all their social, cultural, political, blah 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 contexts, does making wearing those fashions here in the 21st century an act of racism? The answer is sometimes, but not always. The fact of the matter is that there are simply some people on social media who use vintage styles and kind of like vaguely vintage coded styles like cottagecore to embody and communicate racist beliefs. The people that do so tend to identify as traditional life or traditional wife individuals or trad life and trad wife. But the thing is, it's not just that they're wearing vintage clothing that invokes some kind of mythical idealized past that makes it an act of racism, but it's the language that they associate with their idealized clothing choices that forms their identity and communicates their white nationalist beliefs as a trad wife. See, the trad wife movement, to quote Seward Darby in their 2020 book, Sisters in Hate, is a movement advocating retrograde values and hierarchies between men and women, states and citizens, God and humankind. White Christian heterosexual people who represented all that was natural and good in America were under threat from immigrants, feminists, liberals, and LGBTQ people. The trend features and centers around the women who extol the virtues of traditional and exaggerated masculine and feminine Christian gender roles and the values of homemaking. When this plays out on social media, some trad wives intentionally use vintage style clothing to further demarcate masculine and feminine Christian gender roles because those styles are associated with some kind of like mythical idealized past about traditional gender roles. For example, this creator uses components of vintage style and cottagecore like the muted colors, the long skirts, the aprons with the big bows, to talk very directly about her journey from radical feminism into traditional femininity. She talks about how wearing dresses and dresses of this style specifically was a way to fashion her identity into one that glorified a traditional type of womanhood. Furthermore, these posts are tagged using hashtags that use a variety of trad life language such as traditional homemaking, traditional Catholicism, traditional wife, Catholic homestead, anti-feminist, pro-patriarchy. So you see, it's not necessarily that she's dressing in these styles, but then directly correlating it to her personal and political beliefs that fall under the umbrella of the white nationalist movement. In another, more direct way, this creator uses illustrations straight from the 1950s with superimposed text that outlines the kinds of like beliefs and expectations that one should aspire to if they want to embody the trad wife lifestyle. When you put the two together, then it suggests that the body and the clothing in this illustration is an idealized identity of the trad life that you should want to adhere to. There are even some creators like this one here who write posts about the pillars of being a vintage house housewife, speaking directly to the way that you should fashion oneself and the way you should dress in order to align with some historically situated version of traditional femininity. So now you can see that there are some ways in which people can use vintage fashion to specifically communicate where their political beliefs lie, and in this case, the trad life and trad wife community uses vintage fashions to communicate a version of life that is based in a mythicized version of historical American traditional life that centered the white, heterosexual, cisgendered experience. Now, of course, not all people who wear vintage clothing believe in this. I mean, look at me, for example. Would I be making this video if I believed in that kind of stuff? But it's this idea that what you wear equals what you believe in that saw the development of the phrase vintage style, not vintage values. For short, we're going to call it VSNVV. So VSNVV has its roots in Facebook groups from 2007, according to Dandy Wellington, and has since become a slogan and a hashtag for people who are actively working to fight against this type of racism in the online vintage community. It's also used as a way to discuss the way that someone can wear vintage clothing like this and then subvert that meaning and that expectation and disassociate it from its historical context as a form of social activism. I personally remember this becoming popular as a hashtag and this discourse, this conversation happening on Instagram between the years of 2016 and 2018, and as I argue in my paper, correlating with the election of Donald Trump. And some have even referred to the hashtag VSNVV being used as a battle cry in the face of the election of former President Trump, pointing out that we shouldn't necessarily be idealizing the past, especially with the way that Donald Trump was using the phrase "Make America Great Again." Now the hashtag has become a popular and quick way for a content creator to post a picture of their outfit online and signify to their audience that just because they dress in a particular way doesn't necessarily mean that they think in a particular way. To quote the amazing Dandy Wellington himself, "Though my clothes and my style may be old-timey, my perspective on social issues are not. It's to say that I am against racism, against bigotry, and that I respect the bodies of LGBTQIA+ and women. It's that I honor the original custodians of the land on which I'm standing. That though we appreciate what's happening in the past, we are firmly in the now. My now is about inclusion, is about understanding our history for what it is and building on it in a more respectful, inclusive, and honest way so that we can all move forward." So I think that that is a great place to end my analysis, but in conclusion, to recap, I just want to go over a couple of things. First, let's talk about the main characteristics that do make wearing vintage racist. If you wear vintage clothing and you make it about being anti-feminist and pro-patriarchy, if you wear vintage and make it about traditional Christian gender roles, which deny space for anything but a cisgendered heterosexual body, using it to talk about being born in the wrong time period, and using it to talk about how life was better back then. My question for anyone who thinks that way is, who was it better for? Whereas, here are some examples of people who wear vintage fashion and then subvert those expectations and use it as a way to platform their social activist work. We have, of course, Dandy Wellington. Another person I think is amazing is the Vintage Bonita. Sostein, I think is how you pronounce it, because I think her name is Christine. And she is more about historical costuming, but historical costuming is also important to discuss when we talk about historic fashion trends being associated with certain beliefs. And lastly, here are some ways that you can dress in vintage clothing yourself while avoiding this kind of confusion. The first one is to use the vintage style, not vintage values hashtag. There's also the hashtag vintage fashion, not vintage values. Either one will do. Be aware of how you are styling yourself and what that communicates to the world and how it might be upholding European beauty standards. Follow and engage with BIPOC creators in the vintage and historical costuming communities and listen to what they're saying. I've already mentioned a few, but I will leave links to them and all of my other favorites in the description below to get you started. I also suggest using your vintage clothing as a way to engage in anti-racist conversations with your close social group. And lastly, I really just ask that you think critically about your clothing choices, what it is that you're wearing on a daily basis, and how that might impact the world around you. Alright, I think that is everything. Thank you so much for watching. I really want to lean more into discussing the things that I'm learning in graduate school, my opinions on fashion, fashion history, etc. So if you liked this video, please let me know in the comments below. I have many more plans for more videos like this in the future, and I can't wait to share them with you all. Don't forget to subscribe for more fashion-related content, as well as my little grad school adventures in New York, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, everyone!